personality attributes that are just attractive. And like, look at the aspect of confidence. That's not just attractive for women to see in a male that they might consider as a partner. It's attractive for men to see in another man.
Yeah.
It's a human condition. Like, we like confident people. We like confident people so much, we're willing to give them absolute power, even if they are demonstrably a bad thing. Like that, human history is riddled with that. Like really bad dictators. Like Napoleon escaped that island and like walked back to Versailles and like became a dictator again because they were like, look at his strut. Like those edges are creased. That dude is wearing that uniform. Hell yeah. Like, you know, just get behind him. Like, let's just do it.
As an example, I have believed a lot of the stuff that you've said only because you said it confidently.
Nick, I don't believe 99% of what I say. If you say something, but there's an old joke about that, right? That it's the old JFK thing. You know, JFK got up in front of, you know, Berlin and he gave that big speech and, you know, he's talking about the wall and stuff. And he gets up there and he says, "Et bin ein Berliner," and they freak out, you know, and like people are like, what did he say? And like it translates to, I'm a donut.
Like, are you sure? I thought that was a joke.
No, it really did.
Oh.
So a Berliner in Berlin is a donut. The same as hamburger is the name of a city.
Right.
But it's a hamburger, like, you know, or a Frankfurter is the name of a city. It's food. And so a Berliner isn't a person from Berlin. It's a donut that comes from Berlin. And he was speaking to the people of Berlin, and he said, I'm a donut. And they freaked the hell out. Because I've seen a study on this. It's like 10% what you said, 90% how you said it. And you get up there, you JFK that audience, you're going to make it. So if you're out there today and you're wondering, does swagger still count? Still counts, fella. But you don't necessarily have to default to that. You're going to be okay.
Excellent. Well, actually, and this would improve most people's confidence having this research.
Yeah,
so
at least you know the deck's not stacked against you. Be yourself. It's going to work out.
Yeah. You're welcome, America.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are taking your questions. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
Welcome back. You're listening to Pod Therapy, and we're in our advice segment. This first question is about pornography. Okay.
Aren't they always about pornography, Nick?
On this show, it seems to be.
Yeah, we've really degraded ourselves. This whole episode's about sex. That just clicked for me. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the next one is too.
Oh, there you go.
So,
it's for all the miscreants out there. You're welcome, you bunch of degenerates.
All right. So if you don't like sex, earmuffs.
Earmuffs. Yeah, this will be marked explicit today.
All right. So our first listener writes in, is it okay to watch porn in a relationship? Okay, so I was in a relationship with an older guy for 8 years. From the beginning, he said porn was a huge no when you're in a relationship unless you watch it together, so no masturbating. We broke up in October and I met a new guy and we've been dating ever since. I discovered last night that he watches porn and he commented that he masturbates every once in a while. He asked me before if I ever did stuff, and I said no, because I thought when you're with someone, you don't do those things. I Googled it and saw mixed opinions on it, and I didn't say anything to him because I didn't want to make him feel bad. So is porn and masturbating okay in a relationship or not?
Yeah, I've actually seen this question a lot, and I think that there's lots of different opinions on it. So Nick, I'm interested in how you're going to unpack that. I'll tell you my first reaction. I'm, as a therapist, never quite comfortable with being a referee and like telling you, yeah, no, that's great, everybody should do it, or no, nobody should do it, it's a sin against the Lord. Like, I don't take those opinions very often. My first blush is usually in that first relationship, your partner communicated to you that he didn't feel very comfortable with that and that this felt like an outside thing to him. And so you conform to that standard. In this new relationship, your partner's communicating he has no problem with it. He thinks it's healthy. So I don't know that you can bring that old relationship standards into the new relationship and impose those on your mate. So maybe be open-minded and be adaptable. And that's my first impression of that, but...
Okay, well, and I mean, mine, when the question is porn okay in a relationship? My question back is which relationship? Because every relationship is going to be different. There's no right or wrong answer to that, in my opinion. I think that's something that everybody needs to kind of figure out. Is something a problem? Well, it's a problem when it causes problems. right? So, when we do a mental health diagnosis using the DSM-5, one criteria that everything has to meet is it has to be maladaptive. It has to cause a problem. If it doesn't cause a problem, then there's no diagnosis for it. A great case in point would be OCD, right? I think I've talked about it on the show before, how everybody says, oh, I'm so OCD because because I like to have the volume on my TV set in intervals of 5.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not OCD.
I do the dishes after I eat on them.
Right.
I must have a real problem.
Right. I'm so OCD. It's one of those things where it has become it's thrown around a lot. A lot of people say it, but it's kind of lost its meaning. To truly have OCD, it's impacting your life. Now, if you can't leave and go to work because the TV volume isn't set appropriately, now we're crossing a threshold into maladaptive, and this becomes a diagnosable issue. Not that we're really going to diagnose something like, the use of porn, unless it meets criteria for addiction.
Yeah, the bigger point I think you're making is when you're asking a therapist, is this right or wrong, the fundamental way that we think about problems is we look for the result, right? We say, what is, and the phrase I think in the DSM-5, which if you're uninitiated, the DSM-5 is kind of like our handbook, and it comes out every 20 years. They sort of revise it. And the DSM-5 kind of gives us the criteria and says, hey, depression looks like this. It needs to have these 7 little, check marks next to it. If you see all 7, then you can call it depression or whatever. So one of the check marks on literally every single diagnosis is, does this cause and here's the quote, clinically significant amount of distress?
Right.
So that key phrase, clinically significant distress, is when Nick and I evaluate your life and we try to figure out, is this problem running into other stuff? If it's running other cars off the road and hitting pedestrians and causing problems, yeah, it's a diagnosable thing. We're going to call this a problem. But what I hear you saying, Nick, is your first reaction to this is when you're asking me, is porn okay? Well, is it causing anything negative? It doesn't sound like it's causing anything negative in this next one. You're unsure how to feel about it. Mm-hmm. So the real question is not whether it's okay. The real question is, what is your opinion of it? Does it make you personally feel uncomfortable? And if it does, as a therapist, I'm going to be curious about that. Well, why does it? Is there an insecurity factor to this? Is there something about seeing your mate attracted to somebody else that is not particularly empowering for you or whatever? I've also seen, Nick, here's another way to slant this. I've had this question before from a question of health orthodoxy, where they'll say, hey, is porn healthy? And okay, that's a reframe of the same question.
That's a different question.
Okay, go with that. I would say.
Well, I mean, I'll let you finish your point here, but I guess immediately, to me, that seems like a different question because that's addressing, can this cause a problem for an individual, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a such thing as porn addiction, right? I mean, then I would say yes, then that definitely is a problem. So it's kind of like sometimes I think when there are couples that are talking about this and they're asking a therapist, he says there's nothing wrong with it. I say it's a problem. What do you think, therapist?
Right.
I think what they're really getting at is which one of us is right?
Yeah, they want a ref. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the thing is and again, this back to this idea of is pornography healthy? Here's kind of my verdict on it. It's very similar to if you ask me, is wine healthy, right? So, okay, wine can be abused. It can be something that you become dependent on. It can be something that causes a distraction in your life. Is porn doing that? If porn's doing that in your relationship, then I would advise against it. I would advise that we come up with a new way, for you to have a relationship. If porn is a marital aid, or if porn is something that you don't mind your partner participating in because you see it as harmless and you're grateful that, when they're sexually piqued, they're not out there exploring the world, but they're sort of doing this on their own privately, it hurts nobody, fine. But if that causes a distraction to that person, because this is a real point, I want to bring this back. It is true that there is something called porn addiction, and there is a reality, and this is something that, I want to educate the audience on. The number one group of individuals that I now see with erectile dysfunction is not men that are over the age of 50 or into their 60s or anything like that. The number one demographic that I now see for erectile dysfunction is men in their early 20s. And you might think, how is that even possible? Like, at that age, are you kidding me? Like, they're in college? And it's because of the presence of pornography. And here's what's essentially happening to the brain. There's actually a really good video on YouTube if you want to dial in pornography addiction. There's a really great cartoon that sort of explains it. It's G-rated. But it explains how the wiring of the brain works. Brains rewire themselves, an aspect that we call neuroplasticity. Whenever you're re-engaging the brain over and over and over again by touching a pleasure center, you're having the brain rewire to remember where it got that pleasure from. So if you're getting your pleasure from pornography, then your brain doesn't know the difference between a real world woman and this screen, this phone, or whatever's going on. And in time, it learns to not associate sexual pleasure with the real world woman. So when it's put in a real world sexual environment, it doesn't know what to do. And so your body doesn't respond. But then when you're all alone and, the bells and whistles are happening and the right ritual is happening and you're ready to watch your porn, now your body reacts perfectly. And so there's actually a huge problem right now in the world where we're seeing erectile dysfunction among people in their 20s.
I think kind of going along with the neuroplasticity piece, and I think this kind of ties all in the same thing. It's kind of like our brain it's more like it's kind of like it's programmed more to identify new things than things that are constant, right? In the same sense that, if I'm in a room and you spray an air freshener, if it's new, I'm going to catch on to it right away. If I'm in that room for a while, I don't notice it anymore because the brain has identified, okay, this isn't new. Nothing's changing. It's not harmful. It's nothing we need to worry about. It chooses to ignore it.
Right.
I wonder if some of the same thing kind of starts happening with porn, where like when you are inundated with something, because I know that this happens a lot with substances. So if we're talking about cocaine and you are inundated with cocaine and it continues to happen on a regular basis, then the brain's kind of like, all right, this is no longer new information.
Yes.
And it just kind of becomes desensitized, or as we call it, tolerance.
Yes. And so to come back to this question, okay, if you're out there and you're like, hey, I've wondered this for my own relationship, what's the verdict on this? Here's the deal. See pornography like wine. If you're okay with wine in your relationship, but you have a threshold for when you think, you need to readdress this, great. Apply that same standard to pornography. If it's causing a problem, then we have a problem with it. Is pornography inherently unhealthy? The sex therapist in me is going to say, no, that is probably a mythology. That comes from kind of puritanical philosophy. If it violates your religious sensibilities or your worldview or your personal morality, be true to yourself. I'm not going to ask you to, inauthenticate what you actually believe. But is it inherently harmful all by itself? No, it's not a carcinogen. It doesn't inherently toxify a relationship or anything like that. Pornography can be used responsibly, just like wine can, and it can be used alone, just like wine can, and it can be used in a way that doesn't bother your mate, and in some ways can actually add new life and new blood to the relationship if used together or if used separately. And, there's a lot of people that would say there's nothing wrong with an independent, grown-up person partaking in this kind of entertainment for their own personal use. Go for it, and that's the thing I think in Las Vegas, we're probably in that kind of predisposition because we have adult stores all over the city, where people are just encouraged to like go there. In other cities, that's very taboo. Like that's in the scariest side of town. And it's like, this dark, scary place. Over here, it's like, no, they're right next to like Toys R Us. Like it's not weird. So like we're a pretty sex positive city, but I would say that no, it's not inherently unhealthy. Masturbating is not inherently unhealthy. I would say those can be actually healthy behaviors, but also think about it in the context of your personal relationship and look for things like harm. If it's not causing any harm and it doesn't personally violate your moral views, I would say have no issue with it.
Yeah. And I mean, my feedback to the writer, if you're okay with it and he's okay with it,
then it's okay.
Then it's probably okay. But I would encourage you to have a conversation with each other about what would it look like if it did become a problem. Set those parameters so that you each know what to look for. If now you're doing this and then now it starts affecting our sex life, okay, now we've crossed a threshold. So be aware. Those are always good conversations to have ahead of time before you actually reach that point.
Great idea. Have a good picture of what healthy looks like. Have a good picture of what unhealthy looks like.
Very good. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about sex addiction. You're listening to Pod Therapy.
Welcome back. You're listening to Pod Therapy, and we are talking about sex addiction. So, Nick, this whole episode took on a sexual nature. I did not realize it until we were sitting down.
No, I feel like I need to take a shower.
Yeah. Things are getting weird in here, man.